given the fact that things have been changing so rapidly in Afghanistan, and the fact that the capture of power by Taliban has set about a lot of concerns inside Afghanistan and the region of what it means for peace and stability in Afghanistan and the region, I think I fundamentally will look at the aspects inside Afghanistan, the region, and the international community. I think what we saw in terms of the capture of power and the fall of Kabul, it had actually a lot of lessons in terms of the role of the international community in the long-term stabilization of Afghanistan. United States, with its very limited counterterrorism objective and a lot of aversion to nation building, had set on a state building project which actually did not yield results. I'm saying this in terms of a constructive criticism because US has spent considerable blood and treasure and invested in almost in 2 decades a lot in terms of money and a lot in terms of the manpower. But the fundamental issue was in terms of having a unified vision of what the end state should be in Afghanistan. And thereby it was just not the US, but also the international community who were involved both in the military and in the economic development perspective, did not have a clear vision of what they wanted to achieve. So if you look at what happened in terms of the state building, I think it was a very fragile state where there was an whole attempt of having a democratic experiment, which was useful to the Afghans, but which was not sustainable for the fundamental reasons that the international community did not invest in the institution building. And most of the blame is taken by the Afghans in terms of either lack of capacity or corruption. But I would also say that international community did not build in those mechanisms or any kind of accountability measures needed to have Afghans build those open and transparent and representative institutions. So there was a fundamental problem in terms of the state building exercise. But more importantly, it was also about looking at how the money went inside Afghanistan and how most of it didn't make impact, whereby a lot of areas, especially the provinces I visited in remote areas, there was complete lack of access to basic service delivery. And it was in these areas where actually the legitimacy of the state was questioned. And you did see a lot of these people joining the insurgent groups because of lack of opportunities. And thereby, I think the problem fundamentally existed inside Afghanistan in terms of opportunities for the people. And that fed into the narrative of the Taliban, which they used right from 2005 onwards, of driving away the foreigners and also looking at a puppet regime which couldn't deliver. Well, the Afghan government did considerably well. Having worked with them, I can speak about what they wanted to achieve. There was a clear mismatch between what the Afghan government wanted to do and what the international community did. And this didn't translate in terms of having the basic service deliveries to the Afghans. So it was just not about the role of the Afghan government or the international community. It was actually having a unified vision, which was very essential. So this played out in a way in the last 2 decades where we did see a certain amount of fragile gains in Afghanistan, but that couldn't be translated into long-term gains. You did see a lot of progress, which actually the international media didn't report, in terms of a number of girls going to school, women going to work, young people having opportunities. But all of this looked more like a bubble, which couldn't be sustained because Afghanistan continued to be dependent on international aid. And the opportunities which were there inside Afghanistan to generate their own revenue was not well explored and well developed. So the problem of a state which was dependent on international aid continued in ways, and it left a lot of scope for the grey economy to flourish, which actually helped the insurgent groups to derive funding from it. So if you look at the picture inside Afghanistan, you do see a mixed picture in terms of the progress which was achieved but could not be sustained and translated into long-term gains. And that, I think, has been a fundamental problem. The second has been the role of regional powers. And Afghanistan tragedy is that most of its internal contradictions have been used by external powers, and we did see that play out in various ways, whereby certain groups which had affiliations and connections across the borders did get that support, and from which they could carry out their insurgent activities. And this combined with the fact that there were conditions inside Afghanistan which they could exploit, and also the fact that the external support helped them, led to a situation where this group, especially that is the Taliban, could rapidly advance inside Afghanistan and capture power to the bewilderment of most of the international community. So if you look at inside Taliban itself, now the problem fundamentally is it is a terrorist organization sanctioned under the UN with association with a lot of other international terrorist networks and also groups who are extremists, taking on a role of government and having hardline elements will not be without implications for Afghanistan and the region. And the most troublesome one, which we immediately saw after the fall of Kabul, was the humanitarian crisis in terms of people trying to evacuate and not being able to get out of the country, women being worried, and women also fighting for their rights, which was a positive image. And third and most interesting is Taliban trying to project a very moderate and modern image in terms of getting legitimacy in the initial days. But what they were doing in the provinces was more instructive. And that we have seen with the kind of government formation they have in mind, where I think it will be a more of a hardline government. And the gains of the last 2 decades in terms of the constitutional rights, the women's rights, and minority rights, and the achievement in terms of progress, in terms of modernization, would take a back seat. So one is the consequence it would have in terms of the society. Second would be in terms of their linkages with the other terrorist groups, which they have not really broken. And that would be an area of concern. Third would also be in terms of the narcotic production, which has already been increasing, and whether it would actually expand and lead to a more of a situation where you have a narco state developing there. That again would be a concern. So if you look at the picture, it looks very grim at the moment, but it depends on how the international community engages with this group. And that, I think, is something which needs to be explored and discussed in terms of what conditionalities can the international community, particularly the UN, put on this group, given that it is under the sanctions regime. And in the sanction regime, whether there can be conditionalities when they actually engage with this group, and whether that engagement would mean recognition. And if it would mean recognition, how would you deal with the group which has captured power by other means? So I think Afghanistan has thrown up in a very interesting case in terms of the international law and humanitarian law as well. And also the fact that the international community has to have some consensus of dealing with it. More importantly, you also had some resistance by the former vice president, who took on the legitimate role of being the caretaker president and building up resistance to represent the will of the other Afghans. And that actually no one really paid heed to. So we do see a situation developing inside Afghanistan, which could lead to a national resistance in different forms if the hardline regime of Taliban starts imposing those hardline stands, and the national aspirations of the Afghans are not given space and forum to be represented. And we would see Afghanistan descend more into chaos, violence, and turmoil. And it's just not because of the conditions, but also about the presence of the Islamic State, which makes it even more complicated in terms of how those dynamics are going to work out with the Taliban. And the linkages Taliban has with international terrorist groups is something which I think should be a concern for everybody.